Now let's do a little different thing. We have our GitHub homepage. Let's start a new repository. As we know, we can click this button right here, start a project, or we can click this plus sign and choose the new repository option. Let's do this. Let's call our repo project 3. Let's skip the description. Let's make it private this time, just to make it different a little bit. And we have our 3 options right here. And we won't be adding a README file this time as well. So we could upload our local repository on GitHub. Remember that you won't be able to do it if we initialize a repo with this README file, because then the initial commit of this repository will be added by default by GitHub. And that won't allow us to upload a local repository from our computer. So just keep that in mind. So we are not adding our README file. We are not adding the git ignore file. We are not choosing a license. So let's just create our repository, clicking this create repository button. You can see the familiar screen right now. You have some suggestions, what to do right now. Those are quite similar, and we are actually interested in those 2 commands we got here, which are very similar to these commands, but we will get right on into it. Let's go to our Visual Studio Code for now. You can see I have a simple project right here. It's in my project 3 folder on my desktop. And all we have here is this one file, which is index.html. So now let's open our terminal. Let's go to View tab, Terminal. We have it right here. Let's initialize our repository with the git init command. Let's hit enter. Now we can see our repo is initialized. Let's go to our git overlap right here. Let's add this file to the staging area with this plus sign. Let's type the commit message, which would be initial commit. Let's commit these changes by pressing this commit button right here with the check sign. And there we go. Let's check our git status. Nothing to commit. Working tree is clean. Let's don't forget that our branch is called master. It's important since the default branch on GitHub is called main. Let's check also our git log. We have our initial commit made right now. Let's clear our console. So now we want to push our local repository to GitHub to create a remote repository. Let's try to use git push command. Let's hit enter. And this is what we will get. We have no configured push destination. Either specify the URL from the command line or configure a remote repository using git remote add, name and URL, and then push using the remote name git push name. So these suggested commands are exactly the same as we can see on the GitHub page. Git remote add name and URL, which you can see here. Git remote add name URL. And the second one, git push name and the branch. And as you can see in our code editor, git push name, and it's not set here, but you have to point the branch that you want to push to your remote repository. So we have to point the address where our repo is supposed to synchronize with. So let's go back to our GitHub. Let's copy this first command. Let's paste it in our terminal. And this is exactly what we are doing as the first step of creating our remote repository. We are pointing the address to which our local repository is supposed to synchronize with. As you can see, we are using git remote add command, which is exactly here, git remote add. Then we place the name of our address, the default one is origin, but we can name it however we want. And the last step is placing the URL, which would be linked to this name. So we have name origin, and it will contain this address to our repository on GitHub. Now let's hit enter. We don't got any feedback from Git, but trust me, we just settled our remote address and we can check it. Let's clear our console first. And let's type remote with the V flag. Of course, it's supposed to be git remote with a V flag. Let's hit enter. And as you can see, we have the info about two addresses to push and to fetch the changes between our local and remote repositories. Those addresses can be different, but in our case it's the same because we work only with one local and one remote repo. Now let's see what we exactly have here. We can see this address is exactly the same as this one because we have one local repo and one remote repo, and we want to fetch and push the changes between them because in some other cases, in some bigger project, you might want to fetch the changes from one repository and then push them to another one. But that's not in our case. We can see that we have the address for the fetch command, which is the same as the address for the push command, and we have name assigned to this address, which is origin. As you can see, it's a default name, but if we would use another name, typing git add remote command, as we do a moment ago, where we placed origin, if we would place remote repo or something, this name would be visible here, because this name would be assigned to this address, which we also added to the git add remote command. So now we have our remote repository settled. So now let's try to type the git push command to push our changes to our local repository, which is now settled. Let's try to do it. Let's hit enter. And we can see we have an error. The current branch master has no upstream branch. To push the current branch and set the remote as upstream, use git push set upstream origin master. And if you look at this command, you would see it's the same as Git suggests us to put in our terminal. Git push setting the upstream, which is the U flag or U parameter, the name of our remote address, which we set origin, but it could be different, and the name of our branch, which is by default called main on GitHub, but as you could see, it's master in Git. So it's a little tricky, but just remember that those two names can be named however we want. The origin is the default name in Git and GitHub for the remote address, and the main and master are the default names for the default branch in Git and on GitHub. I hope I didn't complicate it more, but let's go back to our code editor. For now, let's clear our console because I want to show you something. Let's hit git config with the list flag. Let's hit enter. And here we have a list of all our configuration setups. You can see our username, for example, our user email. But what I wanted to show you right here are those two lines at the end of the list. We have our remote address named origin with this address signed, which is the same as remote origin fetch. So this one is for the push command, this one is for the pull command. It's set to the same address, but as we can see, it's not enough to push our changes to the remote repository. Let's leave this list by pushing the Q key on our keyboard. Let's clear our console. Let's go to our GitHub once again. And let's copy this last command suggested by GitHub. Let's go back to our Visual Studio Code. Let's paste the command and let's say a few words about it. We have to point out some parameters to push our repo for the first time. U parameter means set upstream, and it sets a constant link between our repos. So after using it once, we can use the git push command without any parameter, and our repo will be pushed to the same address. We can push this repo now without the U parameter, but this way we are going to have point the address each time we use the git push command. So let's go back to our command. To do the git push command, which is right here, we have to point the name of our remote address, which is origin, and the name of the branch we want to push. And that's the little trick right here, because GitHub suggests the name of default GitHub branch, but we know that our default branch made by Git is called master. Now, what's important? We could do this push command without this U parameter. Not like that. Oh, just like that. But then if we change something in our local repository and we would like to push these changes to our remote repository, we would have to type git push origin master once again. But if we once do it with the U parameter, which is settling our upstream with this particular remote repository, if we do it once with this U flag, then all we need to do to push some changes is typing git push. I hope that's clear. Let's use it in practice and you will see what I'm talking about. So let's type the whole thing once again. As we know, we have our remote address named origin, which has the address to our remote repository on GitHub. And as we know, our default branch is called master. And this is what we want to push right now. Let's hit enter. We can see it probably worked. Let's go back to our GitHub repo. Let's refresh the page. And voila. You can see everything worked fine. Now let's go back to our code editor once again. Let's make some changes into our index.html file. For example, let's add an h2 tag. Let's type something in it. Let's save our changes. Let's commit these changes. Let's type a commit message. It's okay for now. Let's commit it. Let's clear our console. Let's see. Git log one line if our commit is made. As we can see, we have initial commit. We have add a h2 tag with a typo, of course, but it doesn't matter for now. So let's clear our console once again. And now, as you remember, we did our first git push command with this U flag, which was setting the upstream. If we wouldn't do that, we would have to use git push origin master command once again to push our changes to this repo. But since we set our upstream the first time, now all we need to do is type git push and everything should be fine. Let's check it out. It probably worked. Let's see it in our GitHub. Let's refresh this page. And we can see index.html was changed with the add a h2 tag. This typo is just horrifying, which was 2 minutes ago. And we can see we have 2 commits now in our repo. Now let's do something else. Let's create a readme MD file. We can do it by clicking this Add a README button. So let's click it. And here we can edit our README MD file. This MD extension might be new to you. MD stands for Markdown. Markdown is a markup language that we can use when creating our README file, which would be displayed on GitHub, for example. Markdown is not a difficult language. I won't be doing a Markdown course right now in this video, but if you're interested in it, you can easily Google it and learn a few useful tricks very quickly. But let's get started with our README file. You can see we have this Edit tab and a Preview tab. If we click it, we see the preview of our MD file. But let's go back to Edit tab. And first thing you see is this hash right here. This hash means this is big and bold text. A title, for example. Something like H1 in HTML. If we place 2 hashes before our text, it would be something like subtitle. We can see it in preview, and we can see it's smaller. And it's the same relationship as between H1, H2, H3 and HTML. If we place 3 hashes, we can get even smaller text. Let's preview it, and you can see it exactly right here. We can also do something like this to make a horizontal line in our file. Let's see the preview. You can see it's displayed like this. Let's go to our edit mode once again. If we place the text without any hash, it would be just normal. Let's see it in our preview. It's like this. Let's add something else to it. And now I'll show you the way of creating the links in our README MD file, which would be something like this. Where you have to place clickable text inside the square brackets and the URL to our link in the round brackets right after. Let's see how this looks in our preview. And it looks exactly like this. Like a link you can click to go to this particular address. So let's commit this file. We have a default commit message, which is create README MD, which suits for us. We are not adding an optional extended description this time. We want this to be committed directly to the master branch. So all we need to do is to click this commit new file. Let's hit it. And we can see our README MD file now is displayed on our repository page. We can see it has been added to the working directory in the create README MD commit just now. So we have 3 commits and everything works perfectly fine. You can also create this file and edit it in the code editor with no problem. When we click the edit mode, if you place something like this in your Visual Studio Code after creating README MD file, it will look exactly like this in your code editor and exactly like this on GitHub when you push the changes to your remote repo. But let's go back to our project page. And there's one thing I wanted to show you in this video. If we go to settings, being on our repo page, let's click it. If you go to manage access option, click it. At this point, you might be asked to type your password once again. But when you do it, here you can give an access to this repository to someone you know and want to work with. So we have this info, you haven't invited any collaborators yet. And to do it, all you have to do is click this button, invite a collaborator. So you could work with the one remote repository with your friend, for example. Now let's go back to our options overlap. Let's scroll it the way down to the danger zone once again. And we have this option, change repository visibility, and assign that this repository is currently private. If we want to make it public, all we have to do is click this button, change visibility. So that will be it. This is how you push your repo. But now let's find out how to pull it. Let's go.